You're watching this right now. 8,500 aftershocks rattling through the Philippines, and the ground just shifted again. Not yesterday, not hours ago, right now. And the news isn't telling you what this really means, what's actually at risk, or why this pattern is accelerating. Let's start where the headlines stop. The Philippines sits on the most seismically active region on Earth. You already know that. What you don't know is that the current swarm isn't a random cluster, it's a signature. It's the Earth's crust telling you something is critically out of balance beneath one of the most densely populated archipelagos in the world. Over 8,500 recorded tremors in a single sequence. That's not routine. That's not normal aftershock behavior. That's not what your government sources are emphasizing when they issue their prepared statements. Here's what happened, and here's what the careful bureaucratic language is obscuring. The initial event struck with the kind of violence that redefined the seismic baseline for the entire region. We're talking about a magnitude that snapped infrastructure, killed people instantly, and sent shockwaves not just through the ground, but through every emergency response system the Philippines has built. But the aftershocks, that's where the real story lives, where the science becomes urgent and where the risk calculus changes completely. When you get into the 8,000 range for aftershocks, you're no longer looking at what seismologists call a standard Omori decay. That's the term for the way aftershocks are supposed to taper off exponentially after a major earthquake. Fewer tremors, smaller magnitudes, predictable rhythm. The Philippines isn't following that script. The aftershocks are sustaining. Some are strong enough to damage buildings that were already compromised. Some are triggering cascading failures in infrastructure that survive the initial shock. And each one is a reminder that the fault system hasn't stabilized. It's still adjusting, still finding equilibrium, still capable of surprise. The most dangerous aftershocks aren't the ones that exceed magnitude 5 or 6. Those get attention. Those make news broadcasts. The dangerous ones are the mid-range shocks, magnitude 4.5 to 5.5, because they hit structures that are already weakened, already stressed, already on the edge of collapse. A building that survived the main event with minor to moderate damage becomes a death trap when it's hit by a sequence of sustained mid-range tremors over days and weeks. The cumulative stress exceeds design tolerances. Cracks propagate through load-bearing walls. Partial collapses become total collapses. And the Philippines, with millions of people living in older structures, with enforcement of building codes that's inconsistent at best and absent at worst in rural areas, is facing exactly that scenario. Let's talk about what the seismic networks are actually showing and why the mainstream coverage is missing the significance. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, PHIVOLCS, has deployed its network across the archipelago. They're recording everything: magnitude, location, depth, mechanism. The data is clean. What's alarming in that data isn't being frontlined because it requires context that most news outlets don't have time to build. The distribution of these 8,500 aftershocks shows clustering, geographic clustering, temporal clustering, and some of those clusters are forming in zones that haven't shown this kind of activity in decades. You're looking at aftershocks radiating outward from the main rupture zone, which is expected, but you're also looking at aftershocks in adjacent fault systems, faults that shouldn't theoretically be activated by the primary event, but clearly are. This is called stress transfer. When one part of the crust ruptures violently, it redistributes the tectonic stress throughout the surrounding volume. That redistribution doesn't happen evenly. It concentrates in certain areas, and those concentrations can trigger slip on faults that were otherwise stable. In the Philippines, that's happening across multiple fault systems. In Luzon, in the Visayas, in the approach zones toward Mindanao. The depth distribution matters too. This is where it gets genuinely serious. Most aftershocks cluster near the main rupture plane, typically within a few kilometers of the surface to maybe 30 kilometers down. But PHIVOLCS is recording aftershocks at depths of 60, 70, even 80 kilometers. These deep aftershocks suggest that the rupture extended deeper than initial analysis indicated, or that stress-triggered slip is occurring in the subduction zone itself. The boundary where the Philippine Sea Plate is sliding beneath the Eurasian Plate. That's not a minor detail. That's the difference between a significant but contained event and a precursor to something larger. Here's what the news cycle doesn't have room to explain. When aftershocks persist beyond the first week, when they're still coming at rates of hundreds per day 2 weeks later, when they're still measurable 3 weeks in, you're looking at a fault system that hasn't found mechanical stability. The rock mass is still moving, it's still adjusting, and in a subduction zone context, that sustained activity can indicate that the rupture zone is continuing to propagate, either forward or downward or laterally, into segments that didn't slip during the initial earthquake. The Philippines is sitting directly on one of the world's most hazardous subduction zones. This isn't like California's strike-slip faults, where earthquakes happen, stress is released, and the system settles. This is a zone where oceanic crust is actively descending into the mantle at several centimeters per year. That boundary is capable of magnitude 9 earthquakes. It has produced them. And the current aftershock sequence, while originating from a more moderate event, is disturbing the mechanical equilibrium of that boundary in ways that historical patterns suggest can be precursory. Let's move to the ground level reality, the actual impact on actual people and actual infrastructure. In Manila, a metropolitan area of roughly 13 million people, the ground shook hard. Older buildings swayed, modern buildings with good seismic design rode it out. But days later, weeks later, inspections were finding cracks that shouldn't have been there based on the intensity of motion recorded at ground level. Shear cracks in concrete, separation at connection points. These are signatures of resonant amplification. The building responded to the shaking at its own natural frequency, amplifying the motion and generating internal forces that exceeded design assumptions. And when each subsequent aftershock hits at similar frequencies, each one compounds the damage. By the time you reach the 800 or 900 aftershock, you're looking at cumulative deterioration that could suddenly accelerate. Outside Metro Manila, in secondary cities and towns, the situation is more precarious. Building stock is older. Enforcement is thinner. Inspections are happening, but they're overwhelmed, and the aftershock sequence keeps coming. People are sleeping outdoors nights. Schools remain closed. The economic disruption cascades. But the physical danger cascades too. Every aftershock is a test that might fail. Every night the aftershocks persist, people remain in damaged shelters instead of returning home to properly assessed structures. It's a triage nightmare with no clear endpoint. The provinces most affected, and this is where geography matters, face different hazard patterns depending on their position relative to the rupture zone. Quezon Province, directly over the epicentral area, is experiencing the strongest and most frequent aftershocks. Camarines Sur and Camarines Norte are seeing moderate but sustained shaking. Laguna, Batangas, and the immediate Metro Manila zone are experiencing enough aftershocks to keep populations in heightened alert. But you move out into the Visayas, down into Mindanao, and you're in zones where aftershocks are weaker but still significant. Strong enough to be felt, strong enough to cause damage in already compromised structures, not strong enough to trigger major responses from authorities. This scattered geographic distribution creates a triage problem. Resources concentrate in the highest impact zones. Outlying areas get secondary attention, and when a magnitude 5.2 aftershock hits one of those outlying areas, which has happened multiple times in this sequence, it strikes communities that haven't mobilized their response capacity, communities whose building stock hasn't been prioritized for inspection, communities whose residents have started to believe that aftershocks are winding down. What the comprehensive news analysis is missing is the correlation between this seismic activity and long-term hazard assessment. The Philippines has known for decades that its subduction zones are hazardous, but the temporal spacing between major earthquakes creates a false sense of security. The historical record shows major plate boundary earthquakes in the Philippines with return periods of hundreds or even thousands of years. The last truly major subduction zone earthquake, the magnitude 7.4 event in 1976, killed thousands. Since then, generations have grown up without that kind of event. Building codes have been updated. Infrastructure has been modernized in the major cities. But in the provincial areas, the institutional memory has faded. Emergency response protocols that existed in the 1970s have been forgotten or superseded. And the current event, even if it doesn't become something larger, is straining systems designed for a smaller threat environment. Let's talk about the cascade effects that are already unfolding. Power infrastructure took damage. Electrical substations went offline. Transmission lines failed. The grid was operating at reduced capacity for days. And you can't do emergency response without power. You can't operate hospitals without power. You can't run water treatment systems without power. You can't charge communication devices without power. The earthquake didn't just create casualties directly, it degraded every system meant to respond to casualties. And aftershocks kept threatening to compound that degradation every few hours for weeks. Transportation networks were damaged or cut. Roads that typically move supplies from Metro Manila to surrounding provinces were compromised. Some were cut completely by landslides triggered by strong ground motion. Others were passable, but requiring bypass routes that added hours to transit times. Supply chain disruption cascaded. Hospitals that needed medications couldn't get them on normal schedules. Communities that needed food assistance couldn't receive it on normal timelines. The aftershocks kept the transportation sector in emergency mode, unable to schedule maintenance, unable to restore full operations. Water systems took direct damage and indirect damage. Direct damage from ground deformation, pipes rupturing, water mains failing. Indirect damage from power outages, pumping stations offline, treatment facilities unable to operate. In some areas, water shortages developed not because the water wasn't there, but because the infrastructure to deliver it was severed. And in a tropical region where disease vectors thrive in warm conditions, water shortage creates secondary health hazards. Contamination becomes likely. Disease risk escalates. Communication systems recovered faster than expected, but not uniformly. Cellular networks came back online in priority areas, Manila, major cities, but rural areas had extended outages. This creates an information vacuum. Communities don't know what aftershocks are coming. They don't know whether evacuation is necessary. They don't know whether infrastructure they depend on is still operating. They're making decisions without knowledge, and some of those decisions are dangerous. Here's the critical piece that the surface level coverage isn't emphasizing. This aftershock sequence isn't finishing. 8,500 counts recorded so far. The rate is declining from the peak, but the decline is slower than historical models would predict. If you're running Omori decay calculations, and seismologists are, you'd expect to see the daily aftershock count declining by a certain percentage each day. You should see it dropping below 10 per day within weeks. But in this sequence, you're still in the hundreds per day range, well past the 2-week mark. That's a red flag in the seismic data. Let's talk about what to do with this information if you're in the affected regions. First, don't trust the infrastructure you could rely on before. Buildings, bridges, electrical systems, water systems, they're all degraded. Some of that degradation is obvious, cracks in walls, structural damage, buckled roads, but much of it is hidden. Stress concentrations in structural elements, microfractures in foundation soil, reduced safety margins in electrical systems operating under stress. You should treat every building as potentially compromised unless and until it's been professionally inspected and cleared. You should not move back into damaged buildings. You should not assume that a building that survived the initial earthquake is safe for continued occupancy. And you should not believe verbal assurances. Get written clearances from licensed engineers. Keep them. Refer to them. Second, aftershocks can trigger events you might not be prepared for. Building collapses are the obvious hazard, but secondary hazards matter too. Landslides triggered by renewed ground shaking in hilly areas. Liquefaction affecting infrastructure in low-lying coastal zones. Submarine landslides potentially triggering minor tsunami waves. Dam failures if any earthen dams were damaged and weakened further under aftershock stress. The range of possible secondary events expands with each significant aftershock. You need to know your local hazard profile. If you're near a slope, know whether that slope is prone to landslide. If you're near a coast, understand tsunami risk. If you're downstream from any water infrastructure, know the hazard profile there. Third, supplies matter for longer than you might think. The emergency window isn't 1 week or 2 weeks. It's 4 to 6 weeks minimum in a sequence like this, because the aftershock rate remains elevated, because infrastructure takes time to repair, because supply chains take time to reestablish. Water, 3 liters per person per day minimum, and account for non-potable water needs too. Food that doesn't require cooking, batteries, fuel, and gas cooking infrastructure are all compromised. Medications that don't require refrigeration if you depend on them. First aid supplies, light sources, communication devices, and charging capability. Fourth, information is going to be chaotic and sometimes contradictory. Official government sources are speaking through bureaucratic filters. News media is covering the crisis as a narrative rather than an ongoing technical analysis. Social media is spreading rumors. The technical bulletins from FIVOLS are accurate but technical and require interpretation. Find sources you trust. University Earth Science departments if they're publishing analyses, international seismic monitoring networks, geological surveys from other countries with seismic experience. Cross-reference information. Don't make decisions based on a single source. Fifth, psychological impact is real and affects decision-making. Aftershock sequences are traumatic. You're living in a state of hypervigilance. Every small vibration triggers threat response. Sleep is disrupted. Anxiety is elevated. That state of mind makes people more vulnerable to poor decisions, to panic, to spreading misinformation. It makes first responders more prone to fatigue-induced errors. It makes coordination harder. Acknowledge the psychological burden. If you're trained in mental health first aid, you're needed. If you're supporting people you care about, mental and emotional support matters as much as material support. Sixth, this isn't over until seismic activity returns to background levels and infrastructure is actually repaired. Not planned, actually completed. That timeline is months at minimum, likely longer. The aftershock sequence will gradually fade. That's guaranteed. But the infrastructure recovery will proceed at the speed of funding, availability of materials, and coordination of work. In areas that are on the periphery of maximum damage, that timeline might be months. In the epicentral area, it could be years. Plan accordingly. Here's what you need to understand about the bigger picture, the part that goes beyond the immediate emergency. The Philippines sits on an active margin where tremendous energy is being accumulated and occasionally released. Subduction zones worldwide store energy over decades or centuries, then release it in seconds. The energy release is cataclysmic, but the energy storage is slow and inevitable. The current event is one data point in a long-term pattern. The question isn't whether another major earthquake will happen. It will. The question is when, how big, and how prepared you are when it arrives. This aftershock sequence is providing real-time feedback on current preparedness levels, and that feedback shows gaps. Systems that should function don't. Communication that should be reliable isn't. Inspections that should be rapid are overwhelmed. Supplies that should be available are depleted or inaccessible. These gaps exist because preparation for low probability, high impact events is always underfunded, always deprioritized until the event happens. And by then, it's too late to do much except respond with what you have. If you're in affected areas, take this moment to make decisions that will matter in the future. Improve your building if you can. Move if your building is in a hazard zone. Retrofit if your structure can be retrofitted. Learn your emergency protocols. Establish communication with neighbors. Keep supplies. Have plans. Get trained. This isn't paranoia. It's recognizing the reality of living in a seismically active zone and preparing accordingly. The aftershocks will continue until they don't. The numbers will eventually decline. The news cycle will move on. But the underlying tectonic reality remains unchanged. The Philippines is sitting on one of Earth's most hazardous plate boundaries, and every day, the stress on that boundary continues to accumulate. Stay aware, stay prepared, stay safe.